Salam and welcome back to Somali Dispatch, SomaliDispatch.com's YouTube channel. My name is Abdulkadir Goulet. Somalia's leadership are once again embroiled in a political dispute with the President Farmajo suspending Prime Minister Robles, allegedly for corruption. In a response, the PM declared that the country's forces should only take orders from him, accusing President Farmajo in interfering in the country's electoral process. To discuss these and other issues, we contacted Abdirahman Aynte. Aynte is a former federal minister of Somalia. He joined us from Nairobi. Aynte, salam and welcome back to Somali Dispatch. Thank you for your time and for answering some of the questions that the Somali people might have as it relates to the renewed feud between the Somali leadership, specifically President Farmajo and his Prime Minister Robles. What's the latest and what's the update on what is this latest rift stemming from?
Well, thank you again for having me. I think this is a situation that is still very much unfolding. The rift is deepening between the president and the prime minister, and I don't think we've seen the end of it. I think in the coming few days, we will probably see the situation much more complicated than it is already. And it's, I think it's very much a function of the current reality in the country. I mean, the minute as we get closer to elections, I think tensions are naturally going to rise. But I think this current rift is quite unprecedented, both in scope and in substance, as things seem to be getting really worse by the day.
Right. As it relates to the latest rift, the president accused the prime minister of corruption, land corruption as it was, and the prime minister rebuffing that and actually resuming and giving orders to the army saying that they should only take their orders from me. Is there anything that's substantiated by, let's start with the president's accusation, because we know there's been accusations regarding to this from some officials from the military, and there was a subsequent investigation. I'll let you fill us in on where that's going.
Well, a couple of things here. First of all, as it relates to anything that is legal, there are independent judicial institutions that are responsible for, for leveling allegations against individuals. As far as I know, there are no, there are no legal institutions or the police or the courts who have accused anything of the prime minister. So for another politician to make an allegation against another politician is certainly part of the, the body politic of our country, of any country for that matter. So I wouldn't really give much credence to that. The other important point to this is that there was a committee set up to investigate this issue. And it's my understanding that their conclusion was that, in fact, that the prime minister was found not to have engaged in the land grabbing that he was accused of. Unfortunately, that report has never seen the light of the day, but I've been told by credible sources that that was the conclusion arrived by the 5-member committee that was set up. At the end of the day, though, this is really less about allegations of corruption. At the heart of all of this is elections and who is going to win the elections at the end of the day. I think there was a pattern over the past 5 years that results of elections were fixed before they even happened. The only unpredictable elections we've seen, and I've said this to you in our last interview, was the one that took place in Puntland. There was no other credible election that took place in this country for 5 years. And so I think that pattern is something that probably people wanted to repeat that, if they feel that they're unable to repeat that pattern, they're going to engage in other side shows, and I think that's what you're seeing. In May 2021, earlier this year, the prime minister was given a mandate in front of the Somali people and the parliament and the international community to lead on elections and on security as well. So I think he should be allowed to run with the elections. Now, having said that, of course, we've seen that the upper house elections was almost entirely rigged by federal member states, with the exception of Hirshabelle and parts of Somaliland. And the initial seats of the lower house elections, about 25 seats or so that were elected so far, were also almost entirely rigged. So there were very obvious irregularities in the elections. And as expected, the CPC, the Council of Presidential Elections, as well as the Somali people and civil society and the international community, all rejected what they saw as a very flawed elections. And so it was only when the prime minister tried to call for an NCC meeting, National Consultative Meeting, that we've seen these machinations around allegations against him. And the only interpretation one can deduce from that is that there is an attempt to undermine his efforts to try and rectify the irregularities around elections.
Right. What does the prime minister's announcement in response to the president's accusations of resuming command of the armed forces mean for Somalis in general?
Well, this is just part of the deepening of the crisis as we know it. I think you're going to see a lot of actions and counteractions. And so when President Farmajo took the highly unusual step of saying that he has essentially fired the prime minister as it was only expected that the prime minister will try and take a counter action. If we look at the legal sort of landscape of all of this, we do know that the prime minister can appoint a prime minister, and that's about the most important power that the president has. He cannot even confirm it through parliament. It has to be done by the parliament, and the president cannot fire a prime minister as it was. And there were if we can call it, our founding fathers who designed this constitution did that deliberately because they knew that the short fuse that our leaders tend to have could easily fire prime ministers every other day, and so they made it that much more difficult for them. So we're now deep into the crisis territory.
Right. It's interesting to me to that point. The Constitution does allow the president to dissolve the cabinet altogether. But one of the credits sought by Villa Somalia was the fact that the president this term at least had a very good relationship with his prime ministers, with this being the second prime minister. But if we go back a bit to the shortcomings of the prime minister himself, he had 14 months to complete this election. The fact that he couldn't, and as you stipulated, having completed the upper house with those many corruptions, what does that say about his abilities to lead Somalia through these tough times?
I think the facts are very, very important. The prime minister was given the responsibility of leading the elections in May 2021, not when he was appointed back in September. Remember, he was appointed on the very same day that 17th of September was signed. And in fact, either his appointment was intended to be a footnote, or 17th of September itself was intended to be a footnote, because you can't do two important things on the same day, because one of them will overtake the news cycle, as those of us in media know very well. Now, having said that, I think the prime minister was only responsible for elections for the last 6 months. And within those 6 months, 3 months after he was given that responsibility, he had a major fallout with the president back in September, we would all recall, and things came to a screeching halt before they then reconciled supposedly, and then the process restarted. One can say that he was given responsibility, he was given responsibility without powers. You've heard the old adage that there is a difference between power without responsibility and responsibility without power. It's better actually to have power without responsibility rather than responsibility without power, which I think is what the prime minister ended up with, and has just only realized that it was, the bad end of the deal. So I think that's something. This is not to justify that there were weaknesses on the side of the cabinet and the prime minister of not really being a lot more forceful than they could have been in terms of really, first of all, preventing the deep, irregularities on the upper house elections and later on the lower house elections. The fact that a sitting chief of NISA could be elected, into the lower house, despite the fact that both our electoral law as well as the procedures of 17 September and 27 May agreement clearly say that any civil servant should resign 3 weeks before, and the fact that he continues to be a sitting, head of NISA really says a lot about the level of corruption and the violations of the rules that our country is facing today.
Right. His candidacy was known, speaking about the spy chief, the current spy chief, but nothing was done. And the elections were, the process went ahead. And when he won, then people started questioning him, which also speaks to the problem that we currently have with the process. In your view, do you think the prime minister can weather this latest dispute? Would he succumb to pressures from Villa Somalia and other stakeholders that let's get along to get along mentality that's been going on for the last 6 months? Or do you think this is it and this is irreconcilable difference?
Well, there is no doubt in my mind that this is an irreconcilable difference. I also think that it's very clear that this is not going to end in 7 minutes like the last time around. So this will require considerably more, political gymnastics on the side of Villa Somalia to try and get rid of the current prime minister, because first of all, you need a parliament to get rid of a sitting prime minister, and there is no parliament at the moment. I think this is going to be much more complicated than we've seen in the past. And the only analogy one can think of is, you will have to go back to Abdullah Yusuf Nur Adde territory and really draw on that experience, because then it was almost impossible for the president to fire the prime minister. And then he resorted to the kinds of things we're seeing right now, which are outside of the legal framework, which then opens the door for all kinds of realities and possibilities. I would also not discount the prospect of confrontation, a military confrontation. I mean, even today, we were quite close to a military confrontation within Villa Somalia. And those of us who doubted or even didn't appreciate the word fragility, I think we've seen what that means back in April earlier this year.
Right. Some cynics have pointed out, or some opposition figures, that this is another way of the president achieving his 2-year term extension. Cynically speaking, or perhaps from your point of view, do you think this is working towards that, or do you think there's a deeper issue at play here?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult to interpret. I mean, it's very clear now that the president was able to maneuver a year in office beyond his legal mandate. And so we're now already into the second year territory within a month time. What is very clear, though, that the second year, if indeed that is the intention, the second year of extension it's going to be far more bumpier than the first year. I mean, the first year was also quite bumpy, but this is going to be probably far more bumpier than perhaps Villa Somalia had calculated the case to be. I think it'll be incredibly difficult to convince the Somali people, as well as our international supporters, that one can stay in power for as long as they desired without facing real consequences. And the consequences could be tragic, not only for Villa Somalia, but for the rest of the country. I mean, frankly speaking, we came back from the brink back in April, and huge credit goes to, I think, the restraint on the side of the opposition, not on the side of Villa Somalia, even back in April. And so I wonder if we're going to see a similar restraint this time around, because the person who actually mediated that restraint was the prime minister. But this time around, he's actually on one side of the conflict.
Right. It's mind-boggling to me to see the fruition of President Farmajo's candidacy after this. But lastly, the international community, Somalia relied heavily on them. And they do have a stake in what's going on in Somalia right now. But the fact that, statement after statement just speaks to the need, the obvious need for reconciliation. Do you think the international community should go a step further in giving their perspective of what is really going on in the country, and why didn't they so far?
I think it's important to put things in perspective when we talk about the international community. First of all, if you are a British or American or European diplomat, Somalia is definitely not a priority in the grand scheme of things. You've got COVID, you've got Russia, you've got China, you've got tanking economy and a million other things to deal with. And in foreign policy, Somalia doesn't even rank high up in their radar. And so simply the sort of mid-level diplomats who are on their 2-year tours in Somalia, who are career diplomats and are not going to move the needle too much. So let's be very realistic about that. And their capitals are not invested in Somalia in the grand scheme of things. They see it as an afterthought at the end of the day. Secondly, I think we Somalis need to start really thinking a lot about ourselves rather than always harking back to the international community, because this is our country, and we need to fix it at the end of the day. Our friends among the international community can help us most of the times, but many of them hurt Somalia on a regular basis, whether it's the neighbors or other countries with a very pernicious agenda. And we've seen that. So it's not always a great idea to actually think that they're gonna, do better, in the context of Somalia. Thirdly, I think the international community are really fatigued about Somalia. After 30 years of investment, incredible amount of investment at that, I think what they see is a fairly miserable outcome, and a collapsed, what they call the elite consensus has effectively collapsed over the past few years. So, if you are sitting in the US Congress or Canadian Congress, or, whatever in the UK House of Lords, and you're thinking about the dollars that are going into Somalia and the results they produce, you're going to raise some serious questions about that, the worthiness of that investment. Having said all of that, I do think there is a scope for the international community to be slightly more, I would say, slightly more stronger in their call on Somali leaders. I think they spend a considerable amount of money, and so I think they should put their mouth where their money is. The statement that came out of the U.S. State Department just a few hours ago, I think, was the boldest I've seen, and since this whole crisis started a year or so ago, it is certainly in the right direction. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, a lot of our leaders do listen to what these capitals say for all the right reasons, and are mortified about it. Abdulkadir, you and I spoke about this. This is a bit of a sideshow, but 99.9% of our leaders in Somalia, including myself when I was a leader, do not have our families in Somalia. Think about that for a second. 99% of the parliament, of any leadership, both at the federal and the state levels. This is something that a lot of people will not admit, but we are trying to lead people where we're trying to lead a country, we are unable to put our own children for education and health. Think about that for a second. So we have, in some ways, very vested interest. And think about the fact that just about everyone who makes more than $2,000 in Somalia have their children outside of Somalia. So the flight of not only human, our families, but also the capital that flees the country. That money is spent in Ankara, Istanbul, Nairobi, Dubai, and other nice places very well. So I think we need to have really a more reflective discussion on this point.
I think you've hit something there, and I think perhaps we're not the stakeholders that we hold some of these politicians. We need a different designation and perhaps a different role for those that really do live as their families wholly live in Somalia, should perhaps be at the lead of this. Pleasure to have you always, and it's for that insight that we always come back to you and ask you for your explanation of what's going on, and I truly appreciate that and wish you nothing but the best, and have a great night.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me again.
I appreciate it. Thank you.